You won't believe what you're about to hear. Let me tell you, the story of Ronald Isley and his brothers isn't just about music, it's a tale of fame, fortune, and deep family secrets that were buried for years. This is how the Isley Brothers became one of the most iconic musical groups of all time. But behind the smooth melodies and chart topping hits, things were falling apart. The craziest part, Ronald Isley, at 83 years old, is finally breaking his silence about what really happened behind the scenes. And when he confirms what's been hidden all these years, it could change how we view the Isley Brothers forever. The Isley Brothers were not just a band, they were a dynasty, the blueprint for everything from doo-wop to funk, soul, and quiet storm classics. They shaped the sound of an era, influencing generations of artists. But as their fame grew, so did the tensions within the family. Behind the fur coats, the falsettos, and the luxurious life, the group was falling apart. There was the battle of the older guys versus the younger ones, and, of course, the inevitable tension caused by money problems. The family was cracking at the seams, but no one knew exactly what was happening. For years, everyone kept the stories quiet, locked away in the shadows. The band's success brought not only glory, but also complications. The problems were brewing for a long time, but the real breakdown happened in the late 70s and 80s when the band was living the high life. Imagine living like a rock star, not just on stage, but off it too. That's what Ron Isley's life looked like. He wasn't just known for his smooth voice or stage presence. Off stage, he was the embodiment of luxury. Think expensive fur coats, flashy limousines, private jets, and wild hotel parties. Wherever he went, it felt like the party followed. Groupies lined up just to be near him, and when the show ended, the night didn't stop. The hotel rooms became a place for wild celebrations, champagne flowing, music blasting, and beautiful women lounging in every corner. But this lifestyle wasn't without consequences. The band's tour organizers had to get creative to keep Ron's late-night crowd away from the rest of the group. The younger members of the band were often torn between the madness of Ron's rock star life and their desire to keep things more grounded. And it wasn't just about the parties. Ron's personal life started to become even more chaotic. Word got out that he had fathered several children with different women, but the family kept it quiet. In those days, the music industry was all about image, and a scandal like that could destroy careers. So instead of letting it leak into the tabloids, Ron's team dealt with these issues behind closed doors. If a woman came forward claiming to be pregnant or threatening to spill the beans, someone from Ron's team would reach out with a lawyer to settle things fast. And while that might have kept the drama out of the public eye, it didn't stop the rumors from swirling. Behind the scenes, the whispers kept growing. Ron, the smooth, soulful gentleman everyone saw on stage, had a private life that was messy. There were constant paternity rumors, and some women stayed silent while others just vanished from the scene. But what's clear is this: Ron's personal life wasn't just complicated, it was a ticking time bomb. But here's where it gets interesting. The internal battles didn't stop at personal scandals. In the early 80s, something started to shift in Ron Isley's behavior. According to those close to him, his attitude began to change dramatically. This is where things get shocking. The rumors about Ron's drug use started to spread. Now, there was never solid proof that he was using cocaine, but the people who worked with him at the time said there was a noticeable shift in his behavior. The confident, calm leader who had once kept things together seemed to be unraveling. The wild parties turned into something darker, and the tension within the group became unbearable. Ron went from being a collaborator to being a dictator. If someone tried to suggest a new idea or offer a different perspective, Ron shut them down without hesitation. Recording sessions, once filled with creative energy, now became all about him calling the shots. Some of the band members felt pushed aside, while others kept their heads down to avoid conflict. It was the beginning of an internal war that would haunt the band for years. The group was no longer a tight-knit family, but a collection of individuals trying to survive in Ron's ever-tightening grip. This was the turning point. No one could have imagined how this would all unfold. From wild parties and personal scandals to accusations of betrayal, the Isley Brothers' story became more and more about power, control, and egos than about music. But this was only the beginning. Ronald Isley's descent into chaos didn't happen overnight, but the signs were there for anyone paying attention. The Isley Brothers had always been a family affair, but now things were shifting in a way that no one could ignore. As the 80s went on, Ron's grip on the band tightened even more, and it wasn't just the music anymore, it was everything around it. The Isley Brothers weren't just a band, they were an empire. But every empire has its cracks, and these cracks were starting to show. By the mid-80s, Ron had begun to distance himself from the rest of the group. The lavish lifestyle that once seemed like a badge of honor now became a symbol of his detachment. While the brothers were out on the road, Ron would often stay behind, choosing to relax in his mansion while the others dealt with the business. His attitude had changed. He didn't want to share the spotlight anymore. Not with his own brothers, not with anyone. But it wasn't just his new mindset that caused the tension. It was also about money. As the years passed, the brothers realized that they weren't making as much from their music as they once had. The early days of touring and recording hits had been the golden years, but as the 80s dragged on, things started to feel like a grind. The brothers had been locked into a deal that didn't quite work in their favor. They were still performing and creating music, but they were also getting older, and their voices weren't what they used to be. Their golden era was slowly slipping away. And Ron, always the one to make decisions for the group, wasn't exactly looking out for the rest of the band. The money they earned from their tours and albums didn't seem to be trickling down the way it used to. Rumors started to circulate that Ron was keeping a lot of the profits to himself. Some of the brothers suspected that he was hoarding money, funneling it into personal accounts, and leaving them with less than what they deserved. This divide started to cause rifts. The younger members of the band began to question their loyalty to Ron. Some started to talk about leaving, others considered going solo. But what was most shocking was the way Ron handled the situation. And instead of trying to patch things up or work together to make the band's future brighter, he became more isolated. He seemed to think that as long as he was at the top of the pyramid, nothing else mattered. What he failed to see, however, was how fragile everything was. As his behavior grew more erratic, the Isley Brothers began to fall apart piece by piece. One of the more stunning aspects of this time was the relationship between Ron and his brothers. While he had always been seen as the leader, the one with the big voice and the charm, his actions made it clear that the family bond was being tested. The group, which had once been so tight, started to splinter. You could see it in the way they spoke to each other, in the way they avoided certain topics. There were discussions about the future of the band, but Ron wasn't willing to compromise. He had become almost impossible to work with, and that meant the rest of the group was left in a difficult position. They were stuck, caught between their loyalty to Ron and the need to survive in an industry that was moving forward without them. During this period, the Isley Brothers didn't just face tension from within, they were also dealing with the changing musical landscape. The world of R&B was evolving. New artists were emerging, and the sound of the 70s and 80s was shifting. The Isley Brothers, once on the cutting edge of soul and funk, now found themselves struggling to keep up. The music industry was starting to favor a younger generation of artists, and the brothers were losing relevance. They had been part of the soundtrack of the 60s and 70s, but the 80s was a different beast. The competition was fierce, and the public's tastes were changing. Ron had always been able to reinvent himself, but this time, it seemed like the world was moving on without him. He still had the voice, but the magic of the Isley brothers was fading. The question began to loom larger. Would they ever return to the heights of their earlier success, or were they simply holding on to something that no longer existed? But despite all the chaos, one thing was clear. Ron was determined to keep the Isley name alive. Even though he was losing his grip on the band, he wasn't ready to let go of the legacy. In fact, he was making decisions that would change everything about the Isley brothers' future. The question was whether his brothers would stick with him or if they would break away entirely. And then, just as everything seemed like it was about to collapse, Ron's personal life took another unexpected turn. His longtime marriage had been on the rocks for years, and it wasn't long before the media got hold of the story. Divorce rumors swirled, and Ron's attempts to keep his private life under wraps began to crumble. As the 80s continued to unravel, the tension within the Isley brothers reached its boiling point. The band's unity had already been tested, but now it seemed like nothing could hold them together. Ron's isolation only deepened, and with it, the divisions among the brothers grew. Those who had once been his closest allies began to question his leadership, and their resentment began to build. The cracks in the group weren't just about money or music anymore. They were about trust, loyalty, and the future of the Isley brothers. Ron had always been the face of the group, but in this new era, he wasn't the same man he used to be. The drugs and alcohol that had once been a part of the glamorous rock and roll lifestyle now took a darker turn. It became clear that his addiction wasn't just a phase, it was something he couldn't control. Ron's health started to decline, but he didn't want anyone to see it. He pushed through the pain, refusing to acknowledge the toll it was taking on him. But those closest to him could see it. They saw how he was losing focus, how his performances began to suffer, and how his judgment became clouded by his personal demons. In the midst of all this turmoil, the Isley brothers were hit with a brutal reality. The industry had changed. They had spent years perfecting their sound, shaping the music world with their unique blend of funk, soul, and rock. But the music scene had moved on, and the world was no longer looking for the kind of music the Isley brothers had once been known for. New artists were taking over, and the Isley brothers' influence was slowly fading into the background. The younger generation had no interest in the classics. In a world that worshipped the new and the fresh, the Isley brothers were becoming a relic of the past. This was the moment when everything seemed to shift for Ron. He had always been able to adapt, to find a way to make the music work, but now it felt like his time had passed. The sound that had once made him and his brothers legends was no longer enough to hold the attention of the masses. The competition from younger artists, many of whom had been inspired by the Isley brothers themselves, was fierce. And while Ron tried to hold on to the spotlight, he couldn't deny the growing sense of irrelevance that surrounded him. As his health worsened and the band began to fracture beyond repair, Ron's behavior grew even more erratic. He became increasingly paranoid, pushing away anyone who tried to reach out. The brothers, who had once been a unit, a family, now couldn't even speak to each other without tension. The younger members began to voice their frustrations more openly, no longer afraid of what Ron might do or say. Some had already made plans to leave the band, fed up with the way Ron was running things, but the fear of breaking the Isley legacy, of abandoning everything they had worked for, held them back. The final blow came when, after a heated argument, one of the brothers, who had been with the group from the beginning, made the difficult decision to leave. This wasn't just a musical departure. It was the breaking point of years of unresolved issues. The Isley brothers, as a unit, were no longer the same. What had once been a family affair had now become a business venture, one that had lost its heart and soul. With his brother gone, Ron found himself standing at the top of the Isley empire, but it felt hollow. The world no longer saw him as the visionary leader who had once revolutionized music. He was a broken man, isolated from his own blood and surrounded by the remnants of a legacy that was quickly fading. In the silence that followed, Ron was forced to confront the painful truth. He had lost everything. His health was deteriorating, his family was fractured, and his music no longer resonated the way it once had. But even in the depths of despair, Ron refused to give up. The idea of walking away from the Isley Brothers, of letting go of everything he had built, was too much to bear. He clung to the name, to the legacy, trying to salvage what little was left. And just when it seemed like all was lost, a glimmer of hope appeared. An unexpected opportunity came knocking, an invitation to perform at a high-profile music event that could bring the Isley Brothers back into the spotlight, even if only for a brief moment. Ron knew this was his chance. This was his last shot to prove that the Isley Brothers still had a place in the world of music. But even as he prepared for this final chance, the demons that had plagued him for years threatened to consume him. Would he be able to rise above the chaos, or would he fall deeper into the abyss? The tension was unbearable, and with each passing day, it seemed like the Isley Brothers were edging closer to their final curtain call. Ron had reached a crossroads: hold on to what was left, or let it all go and move on. As the years wore on, the Isley Brothers' story seemed to be one of slow decline. Ron, once a towering figure in the music industry, found himself at a crossroads. His struggles with addiction, his fractured relationship with his brothers, and the changing music landscape had left him isolated. But despite all that, there was one thing that Ron couldn't shake: his love for music. The passion that had once driven him to create groundbreaking hits was still there, buried beneath the pain and disappointment. And though the Isley Brothers' legacy was no longer at the forefront of the industry, it was undeniable that their influence had been vast and enduring. Ron's health, however, continued to deteriorate. The toll of years of partying, substance abuse, and the stress of maintaining his role as the face of the Isley Brothers was beginning to take its final toll. The years had not been kind to him, but he refused to give in to the inevitable. Even when the doctors told him his time was running out, Ron pushed forward, determined to go out on his own terms. Despite the personal and professional turmoil, there was a brief moment when everything seemed to come full circle. In the late 90s, after years of tension and silence, Ron reached out to his brothers. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was enough. They agreed to reunite for a final tour, one last attempt to bring the Isley Brothers back to the stage where they had once been so dominant. The reunion was bittersweet, full of joy for the music, but heavy with the weight of years of unresolved issues. For a fleeting moment, the Isley Brothers were back, performing in front of loyal fans who still remembered the magic of their sound. But even in those final performances, the cracks were still visible. Ron's voice, once a commanding force, was no longer what it had been in its prime. He struggled to keep up with the younger members of the band, and the old magic seemed harder to grasp. The energy that had once been electric now felt strained. It wasn't the Isley Brothers at their peak, but it was something that fans could hold on to, a reminder of a time when they had redefined soul and funk. As the tour came to an end, Ron found himself alone once more. The brothers had gone their separate ways again, their relationship still fractured. Ron was left to reflect on everything that had come to pass: the highs, the lows, the successes, and the failures. The Isley Brothers had given him everything, and in many ways, they had taken everything from him as well. The fame, the fortune, the acclaim, all of it had been built on a foundation that was no longer solid. In the quiet moments, Ron began to accept the truth of his journey. He had been a visionary, a creator, and a force in the music world, but he had also been a man who had been lost along the way, lost in addiction, in pride, in the fight to keep his legacy alive. As the years went on, he found peace in the music, in the songs that had defined him. His past was filled with both brilliance and mistakes, and he could no longer deny that both were a part of who he was. The Isley Brothers had made their mark on music history, but for Ron, the legacy was more complex than any single achievement. It wasn't just about the hits or the fame, it was about the music that had been created, the lives they had touched, and the way they had redefined the soul of America. But now, as Ron looked back on everything, he understood that sometimes the greatest legacy wasn't in the accolades or the applause, it was in the lessons learned, the mistakes made, and the forgiveness that could eventually bring peace.